Welcome back to INTERPHEX Live. And today we're going to lead off. We're going to lead off with one of my favorite topics. And the reason being is I've seen in my 40+ years in the oral solid dosage form at least 4 projects that get crashed, burned, and mutilated because of total screw up on the controlled substance side. I think it's a misunderstood area, one that I think everybody should be educated in. Take it from me. I got the scars to prove it. So today, helping us out, Mike Velazza from Catalent, David Mayers from Wellspring, and a latecomer, Lisa, who bailed us all out, actually 10:30 the other night, right? Thank you very much. Lisa Temish from Pfizer/Hospira, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so my first question is pretty simple, all right? So, if I'm gonna do development work, all right, and I've not worked in any controlled substances before, I mean, let's assume that, you're in an organization, all right? So where do I start? In other words, we're going to get this perspective from a couple of CMOs and from an owner company. But Lisa, let's talk about somebody comes up at Hospira and all of a sudden they're asked to use a controlled substance, and we haven't done this before. So what's your guidance that you give them?
Well, anytime you're working with a controlled substance, the key is making sure that you've got the right license. So understanding what's going to be the activities that'll be occurring at the CMO, as well as what will that marketing authorization holder be responsible for. So understanding who's going to hold the analytical service license, the manufacturing license, as well as the importer-exporter license. You can't do any work with a controlled product unless you have the appropriate license in place to begin with.
And these licenses are product-specific, drug-specific? How does that work usually?
Well, first of all, you've got to have your facility designed for the activities. So it's not going to be specifically product or drug specific at that point in time. But then as you talk about the quota, that will absolutely be drug and API specific. And so that's another component of the DEA requirements.
Okay, so let's say, okay, I'm going to go to a CMO, Mike, and I want to pick it, hydrocodone. So where do we start,
Well, I'd say the first thing that we try and make sure everybody understands, if you've never done it before, Russ, is the time it takes to actually get everything in place is a lot more than you're going to anticipate. It's not like your regular development proposal. So typically you have to outline what you want to achieve. We get it from our clients on their letterhead. We're going to have to take that together with us and then apply for the quota, which takes 8 to 12 weeks typically, because it's all DEA, their volume. It always helps to have a track record with them, so you may be on the 8-week or 6-week side sometimes versus the longer end. You can't do anything. You can't order the API. You can't start anything in the projects other than maybe outlining the experimental design and starting to talk about analytical methods. But you can't even, unless you already have reference standard from another project, you can't even do the method development, right? So to the beginning of your question was like, if you never did it before, you got to build 3-4 months in before we can even start the project just to get all the DEA paperwork in place.
David, so is this, you've never done that drug substance before, or is it you've never done that controlled substance report? Can we elaborate on that?
Well, it can be both. I think that people misconceive even the scheduling of these products as well. If they're coming at it with very little insight, in our case, coming from Canada, you also have to look at where is the API coming from, and it can be critical if you have some activity. Let's say you're transferring a drug, and it actually was produced in Europe. That can be significantly different than a product that's, let's say, made right now in the U.S. So you have to look at all those things.
And is that, but again, I mean, if you've done a controlled substance before, so Lisa, I mean, if we've done, I don't know, we've worked on hydrocodone before, but I want to work on, say, oxycodone now, and you have never worked, you know what I mean? In other words, what else do I have to do? I mean, yeah, you did controlled substance, but no, I never did oxycodone. So what happens then?
Well, and that's when you have to look at, make sure you've already got the appropriate license in place. So again, are you just bringing it in as an importer? Are you just going to be the manufacturer of that? If nothing has changed based on the license you already have, you're covered from that standpoint. But then the quota piece still has to come into play. You've still got to go out and request that quota, and that, as he said, that's going to take anywhere from your 8 to 10 weeks in order for that to occur. I think the other thing that's important, if you're looking for a CMO to be able to manufacture controlled drug products for you, is there's other controls that have to be put into place from a manufacturing and laboratory standpoint. Thinking about the DEA is a little different than other regulatory agencies, because the DEA is really about accounting in some respects, being able to account for everything that comes into the facility, how it's utilized in the facility, and then what you're exporting out of the facility, and demonstrating the controls that you have in place throughout that process. So there's other security and control measures that you also have to take in mind, not just the license and the quota activities.
What sort of control activities are we talking about, David?
Well, in some countries, for instance, there are different security regulations that may apply. In Canada, for instance, both those compounds are managed the same, but you can have based on what we call street value in Canada, and there's other regulatory bodies that have similar approaches. You can actually have two different compounds that are managed significantly different. Something such as fentanyl, as an example, needs to be managed differently than something like codeine, as an example. So it's significant to understand that, because when you look at your timeline, again, we've been talking about how long it takes to get this in place. But if there's a security change that needs to be made, or there's something that's physical that needs to be done to the plant, that's not a 6 week, 8 week, 6 month thing. That can be a year, and that can be significant.
So fentanyl brings up the thing that you reminded me too. You also have to have the safety people look at it too. Because if you're working with a product like fentanyl, you need to have a nurse on board. I mean, you don't have time to get somebody, if they accidentally get exposed, good odds they're dead before they get to the hospital. So if you don't have the proper staffing on staff, somebody could administer Narcan or something like that. You have to look at it all with that. So there's extra controls there. There's also controls, whether you're talking about a controlled substance class 2 versus 3 or 4. Do you need a vault and all the controls there, and with a day cage and everything else, where you're storing the active and all the intermediates while you're waiting for the granulation to become tablets? You're moving through it, and or you just need a cage if you're doing benzodiazepines or something in another class. So it's all that knowledge, and having basically a separate group that deals with the DEA and all the ARCOS reporting, as opposed to the regular quality function.
I got you. So Lisa, if you're going to go in, let's just say, at Hospira, we're going to outsource a particular product, or you're going to go to a CMO you haven't gone before, what guidance do you give to people that go on site to take an audit? What do you tell them to look for?
Well, again, you're looking at something different than you typically would if you were looking at it from an FDA standpoint. It's all around that accounting piece. So do they have training in place that is designed specifically for the controlled products? Do they have resources, again, to his point, that are focusing on those controlled products? And how do they ensure that these individuals are going to have the best interest in mind for that product or that drug? Making sure that you're preventing any kind of off usage or stealing of it, because really that's a concern that's out there. So you want to look at the systems that are in place, but the systems that are in place to really focus on the DEA activities. Again, such as that accounting. How are you accounting for it? How are you keeping it under lock and key? What's the training systems that you have in place for the individuals that are going to be interacting with that product and be handling it? Is it acceptable for them to handle it one-on-one? Have they been trained? And are you confident in their ability to be able to handle that product by themselves and not have a second person there as a witness of all the activities that are going on?
So Dave, the facility, what customarily is done, is the facility then designed to be, I would guess, for Schedule 2, you take the most stringent and you design a facility from there, or what approach do you take as a CMO?
Well, if you're doing a review of it, going back to the audit question, you would look at it from two aspects. What my experience from Purdue Pharma, for instance, we would have our security team look at that separately from more of a regulatory perspective as well. So you'd have experts that go and look at the actual control of the material, so that it's about, like was discussed, the reconciliation of everything that's being used. So it's not just about how you manage and how you hand off material, but it's how you're shipping, how you're storing, how you're, your dust collection. So it's a multitude of things you look at. But you need to have the experts from each discipline look at how you're managing it. Your supply chain activity is not something that an auditor who has GMP experience, for example, can honestly look at for a product such as what you're describing. You need to have an individual that has had that experience and understanding the control of the material, how it's being, whether it's locked up or whether it's in separate caging or how it's being managed. It has to be done by an individual that has that level of expertise.
Are the rules different for a CMO as opposed to, say, a Pfizer or Novartis, or how's
The
that
rules
work?
are DEA. I mean, they're all there. I mean, at the end of the day, FDA comes in, if you want to draw that parallel, they'll do an inspection, they'll give you a report. DEA comes in and is really looking for violations that could lead to diversion. And the fines could be stiff if you don't have the controls in place. It's like you were saying, you need, how are you going to handle during the day? You got to walk through the day. Now the person goes to lunch and you're in the middle of a tablet run. Do you take everything, put it back in the vault? How do you secure the room? Right? Do you put a motion detector in there with an audible alarm so if somebody goes in, lock the door? That's what we do. Do you have cameras or you don't have cameras? Do you have observers and cameras? Do you do a mix? How do you gown?
Yep.
You have pockets in the gowns, right? So you're gowning. Do your pants now have pockets, or they're all sewn closed? Because you could slip a couple tablets of OxyContin in there, and there's a lot of people that pay a lot of money for that. You steal 10 tablets a day, so you got to be thinking, almost like all your employees are criminals. I hate to say it, and work your way back.
That's reality.
And because you don't know, there could be one person there, and it sinks the whole ship.
Guy who gave me the guidance was, the first time I got involved, was you're guilty until proven innocent in DEA.
Yeah.
Yep, right? I mean, bottom line is they figured, I've only went through one DEA audit, and FDA wins definitely over them, but the assumption is, you are guilty. There's no question.
Well, one of the procedures we had to change, you didn't think about, you mentioned it, was we never changed our dust collector procedures. And then all of a sudden we're having a reconciliation and we're missing something. It's like, oh, we better go check the dust collector. So right away, it was everything that we made in that run. It was probably when we first got into controlled substances. We never looked every time, and we were weighing. If you're working off the little dedusters and everything that comes off the compression machine, at the end of the day, now you had to change the procedure, work with quality to have a totally different procedure for reconciliation of everything when you're working with controlled substances as opposed to when you're working with other substances.
Yeah.
Sounds to me like the maintenance guys have to be educated as well.
You have to secure the dust collection.
Anybody that will have exposure to that product needs to be able to go through the training program and demonstrate that they've gone through that program. And we even go a little further at the Pfizer site that I'm at, where you've got on your individual badges, we've identified the individuals that can truly be handling that drug product on a daily basis and can be left with it, individually.
So this is
not
specialized
everybody
training.
can. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry.
And you want to minimize the number of people that truly have that capability of handling that product day to day.
Yeah, and you can identify. So from a security perspective, you identify those individuals immediately. Most people, will know each other, but if it's a large campus, you need to be able to separate individuals appropriately. So.
Well, and then it's also controlling access to where you store the stuff. Like, for example, we've got where all the API comes in, you could drive a fork truck into the vault, it's totally enclosed. No one person, or there is one, but I think it's one, but no one person has the alarm code and the actual combination to open the vault.
Right.
So those people always have to be together. So the odds of people actually conspiring together to try and divert a huge quantity of API, it becomes negligible, because only somewhere in the security office really is the two codes together. So either you trust your security or you don't, but you never give the people the temptation to do something that essentially they're really going to regret doing because they'll get caught.
We talked about commercial and we talked about developmental. I mean, so obviously internally there's got to be a segregation of quotas. And can we touch on that? Let's start with Lisa.
Yeah, I think regardless if it's a commercial or a developmental state, if it qualifies as a DEA controlled product, you still have to have those controls and safeguards in place. So if that means you've got a separate laboratory that's handling it from a development side, they've also got to have a safe, and they've also got to have the procedures in place and the people trained in order to handle and be able to work with that product on a day-to-day basis. And the same would be held true with your quality individuals in the quality lab. You asked originally about the design of a facility, And I don't really think that you have to design a specific facility separate from non-controlled product versus controlled product. It's really, again, about all the controls and safeguards that you put into place. If you do have a vault, you know, what's the width of the walls of that vault? Are they rebar reinforced ceilings and floors? And just, you know, do you have the right securities from a camera standpoint? My experience with a DEA inspector is they've actually come in and they'll have one individual stationed at the security guard, and another individual will actually walk through the facility making sure that all of our motion sensors trigger like they're supposed to and they're designed to. Because again, it's about safeguarding that product and being able to account for all of it at the end of the day. It's not in the same realm of what you're looking at from an FDA standpoint.
Yeah.
All right, let me see. So, how does the quota work, though? I mean, that's got to be. I mean, coming from development, I got to tell you, I screw up forecasts all the time. Then I had to deal when I have to deal with 2 forecasts, it's a total disaster. So, what are we talking about, Dave?
Well, one area that we've had some issues with really is around where you'll have you may have, let's say, a generic coming on board as a CMO. You may be even supporting them. You have more than one quota, so therefore you can have commercial activity and research activity that is separate, and you need to make sure that you're managing that appropriately. Each country is different. I have more experience with Canada, but the reality is that you need to make sure that that's appropriate, because it's very common as you acquire a tremendous amount of API or whatnot that year, you will use up a tremendous amount of that quota. So that needs to be something that's managed. And I find that the regulatory bodies, certainly in Canada, and I find in Germany and the UK, they're often behind. It's great you can go to the World Health Organization and get a reinstated quota, but the reality is you need to be managing that ahead of time, because you'll get caught in a situation where you transfer that product, take it from the development to the commercial, and that's where you get into trouble or issues.
So how does that work? So let's just say I'm working over a Catalan, and I've decided, we're going to take it through pilot. We're going to do our scale up. So who owns that quota?
Okay, so there's also 2 different quotas too, Russ. So who owns the quota is essentially we own it together when it's still in development. You've got to outline the experiments, figure out what you need to do, how much material you need for the clinical trials, and we'll apply for that quota. On the development end, you can actually even get replacement quota. Yeah. So if for some reason one of the batches failed, you didn't get the result, you're not going to use it in a clinic, you can go back in and replace that quota and show that you've destroyed the material and it wasn't used, and you can get additional material. When you're ready to go to commercial, the commercial quota is much tougher to get. They're looking at the whole world or the whole region, and they know this is the demand for this product, and if it's X number of millions of tablets, we're only going to give enough quota out for X number of millions of tablets. So it's almost jockeying for position, because they're not going to give everybody 2x the amount of hydrocodone tablets that they need just because we put the number in. Right? Yeah. At the end of the day, so you've got to work with your customer. You've got to get the quota in early. We've put them in as early as February for the following year to get them in the system, in the queue. This is what our customers' demand is. And they'll look at the IMS data and who the client is, and is their market share gaining or going down? I remember the first year we were actually working with a brand that the generic came in. The brand was all upset they only got half the quota. DEA knows that generics are going to cut into the sales, right? So later they said if your sales are there, you can apply again and they'll move quota around. They'll take quota away. Right. So really the quota is owned by both of us, but it's facilitated by, in our, we talk about CMOs, by the CMO, because we are the ones, our name's on a 222 form, and we are the stewards and have to manage the risk of diversion with that API.
The reason I asked the question, because there's always some, shall we call them, bright sales guy who figures that, well, you guys in development are slow, you're going to delay, but you know what? We could block our competition by going in for more quota than we need. Essentially, it's a set number, right? I mean, bottom line, if they say there's going to be this much methylphenidate in the world, that's it.
That's it. They authorize the synthesis, the API companies to only make that amount.
Correct. That's available.
So that's where it starts, right, at the API. And then if they're only allowed to make this much in a calendar year, then it's just rationed out, basically, or portioned out.
But Lisa, you're shaking. I mean, the answer is that game don't work. That don't wash.
No, because the DEA controls it so close. You know, like he mentioned, they understand what's going on worldwide and they're monitoring that worldwide. Now, obviously, if you've got a commercial product out there and one of your competitors goes off market for a GMP FDA concern, they recognize that as well. And so if you do request that extension of a quota, you know, there's an understanding reason behind that. And you have to be prepared for a timeline. You know, there's always going to be some time frame as far as how long it takes for that extension, but there are definitely reasons why you can go in and ask for it.
But you know what? It differs as you go around the world, because in the US, the DEA is usually ahead of most for quotas. But I mean, I've seen UK and Canada as an example be behind. We've actually helped manage the quota. At one point in time, I worked for a company that had about 70% of the quota for Canada. And the reality is they weren't managing that. So if there's a generic coming on board, or from a CMO perspective, you want to be able to support production, there wouldn't be enough quota for you to do anything. So you need to work with that regulatory body to be able to advise, here's what's happening, here's why this is, and that innovator or the brand name is actually not going to have that quantity or the need for that quantity because this is being brought into the market this year or next year.
But what about the bursts? What about the, oh my God, I screwed up? You know, I mean, the answer is, let's face it, things go sideways in production. What happens then? I mean, so in other words, I'm going to miss it. I'm not going to get my, you know, bottom line is my batch or two batch went sideways for whatever reason. That puts me behind the 8 ball on a commercial distribution side. How soon does that sob story get looked at and approved and you get, okay, we'll give you that much more?
Yeah, so I think if you want to go sideways, it's better to do earlier in the year, because it is done on a calendar year basis. You mess up something in February, you should have enough quota. It's given on an annual basis. You could draw against it but you're also asking for that replacement quota on a commercial scale. If you have an issue come up in November, you're not going to get replacement quota, you know, and there might not even be any more raw material available that year to be sold, you know, based on what the API suppliers were allowed to do. So, you know, I think the bigger issue more is, as David said, you know, also, and Lisa already, is if you had a bump in sales, you got to be on top of that.
Right.
And you can, you know, they'll be tracking it. They'll know that customer who's your partner, if you're a CMO, has seen increased sales. Here's the reason why. And you've got to apply for that quota maybe 3 or 4 months before you get the extra quota. You can place the order and get the API in, test it and release it, and be able to make more product. So you always got to be thinking a quarter, 2 quarters ahead in your production schedule.
Okay, but I mean, what's realistic? All right, I project I'm going to need, let's say it's 1,000 kilos. All right, what is it 1,000 kilos plus or minus 10%, or it's 1,000 kilos? So in other words, what I'm saying, where do I bump the number before I ask, or you follow what I'm saying? I mean,
I think there's a small window of extra that you can ask for, and they're going to evaluate that based off, again, the sales and what you've historically requested. If you go in and you throw a pretty substantial increase in there, they're going to question that. You know, I think that there is a really small, safe window that you can ask for that's going to give you extra, but at the end of the day, you've got to be able to account for it and talk about it and explain why.
Yeah, it's credibility too, Russ, because
Yeah.
you're sending in our ARCOS reports in at the end of the year, which is inventory on hand. So if you're consistently always having excess inventory, then you know you just can't. You know, if you did 1,000 kilos and you put 1,100, you may get 1,000 kilos, right? But if you're putting in, you need 1,000 kilos, you're putting 2,000 kilos, and they give you 1,500, and you still have 500 in the vault at the end of the year. They know that.
Right. Right.
And the reality is we're all doing this. So it's going to be who manages it the best, who's having the right conversations, who's doing it early in the year. Because that's when, you know, whether it's DEA or anybody else, that's how they're making their evaluations.
Gotcha. So let me ask you this. So we'll start again. All right. Is that the same across the board? In other words, Schedule 2, Schedule 3? I mean...
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's not, right? I mean...
It's not. The most difficult Schedule 2, you need a quota to buy the API because you're using a 222 form on Schedule 2. Schedule 3 and Schedule 4, you need to list it on your license, get approval to handle it, and have a cage and be able to manage it. And they'll do it when they come in for their audit. They'll check your inventory.
You bring a good point there, Mike. And I think that's the one that I've stepped on once or twice. The answer is, have you handled controlled substances? And the answer is a resounding yes. And I always forget to ask the second question was, have you handled this controlled substance?
Yeah.
So let's start with that one. I mean, it turns out that unlike making, let's pick, something in the cardiovascular area, when you're talking, one size don't fit all. You have to have this very specific license. How's that work? Lisa, let's start with that.
Well, at our site, we actually only manufacture Schedule 2, so I don't really have a lot of experience with the different schedules. I mean, I know it's still being able to demonstrate the levels of control that do come into place. And I think the other thing to remember and think about is the product itself may have some specific requirements. We actually have one that also requires cold storage. So not only do you need a controlled room temperature storage location, but you also have to have the ability to have it in a cold storage area as well. And that again is a different security level and different location within your facility that you've got to be able to control the access and be able to demonstrate that you're following those regulations.
So, but if tomorrow, let me say this, like if tomorrow you decided you're going to work on a different compound, that's not on the list. It's not, the license has to be written specific. That's what I'm saying, right?
Right.
Not only
Right.
does the facility security have to be specific to the schedule, but the license has to be specific to the drug substance you're working with, right?
Right, and the schedule that they are within, yes.
And you don't want to list every potential controlled substance that there is out there on the license, because then it becomes unwieldy to manage as well. So every year when you have to register the facility, you re-register and you list the compounds that are either active, current, or the ones that you potentially may work on that next year, and you can add and delete them off your license.
Right.
And our facility handles 2 through 5, Schedule 1 actually an analytical, because you do get some analytical byproduct or manufacturing byproducts in development that when you test analytical, they're still C1. So we typically, I don't know if you have the same issue at yours in the analytical side, but you need to have a C1 license for analytical as well, because what do you do when you get those, products that are never been tested, but they're still, opioids or whatever side products that come off the chain. So, but again, your C2s are the ones where you need the quota. You don't need a quota for C3, C4, but you need to have them on your license. You need, handle, there's a different level of security, a little bit lessened. That's why it's C3, C4, but it's still security nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. So I find that, so in other words, degradation products,
Yeah.
if they are considered pharmacoactive,
Right, they could be pharmacoactive, but they've never been tested for activity, or they're just not, they could have a lot of bad side effects or whatever, but they're still, if you take them, LSD, think of stuff like that, that's a pharmaco, whatever, it comes off as a side effect, or a degradant product, it's C1. If that's going to show up in your formulation and you don't have a C1 license, you need to then find an analytical laboratory that can handle C1s.
okay. So that becomes pretty complicated.
Yeah, it
All right,
does.
so let me say, so the answer really is some of it's pretty straightforward. Let's face it, rutylenic acid, no problem, right? I mean, there's an example. Goes from Schedule 2 to who cares, you know what I mean? But what do you do then? I mean, so Lisa, as an innovator company, is this something you guys actually look at?
Again, in the role that I'm in, I don't have a lot of exposure to it as we're bringing it in. But I think the other thing that's important from a CMO standpoint is understanding, again, the roles and responsibilities. So to the point that he's making, if I'm never going to take the product into my laboratory and it's currently as a Scheduled 1, I don't have to have the analytical license as that Schedule 1. The partner, whoever I'm making the drug for, would need to have that. So you've also got to be able to outline those roles and responsibilities.
How often does that happen, Dave?
I've never experienced as a CMO, but it does happen. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends on the nature of the products, and usually with these products, you don't see a lot of API synthesis changes. I find, so you should know it up front, but reality, it can occur, and as you develop new dosage types or you get into other products, I mean. Most of them are established, so like I said, I haven't seen it too often, but it can happen.
No, most of them are known. I was going to comment the same comment if you didn't make it, David, is, especially in the opioid area, everybody knows all the known degradants. So if you know you're going to be testing them and you know you need a C1 license because they're not pharmacoactive approved, but they do have activity, and they're just class C1, you need to make sure you have that, and you're only going to get it for the analytical laboratory, obviously. You're not going to manufacture those compounds. They have no use to, the whole medical marijuana opens up a whole other issue, though.
Yeah.
Because
Absolutely. Yeah.
now you're dealing with compounds that on a federal level are C1, and then state to state that can be not C1.
Yeah.
So, you know, that whole area is, I'm no expert at all. And, but I can tell you, it gets very complex.
We're going to legalize it soon anyway. So.
Actually, you guys should have been here for the discussion yesterday. Yeah. They're actually, so you know, they're looking for people to make transdermal cannabinoid. So anyway, that is a totally different subject. But one of the things that globalization, all right, obviously, the desired state is you make it in one place and ship it where you want it to go, right? So, you know, you're going to make it in wherever and then distribute it ROW, right? So, we got this Schedule 2 compound. Looks really good. I want to do global distribution. Where do I start? I mean, who wants to take the first shot here? I can tell you it's a... I would lateral that too.
I can start. The first thing that you really need to look at is who has a closed market, and can you move that product at all? For instance, I cannot make I cannot make an oxycodone. I can a good example. I cannot make OxyContin as an example in Canada and ship it to the U.S. That's why that company, a former company of mine, that's why they produce it in the U.S. Whereas for worldwide distribution, it's actually produced outside the U.S. So that's quite common. You'll find closed markets. And the other thing too is the scheduling of drugs is different from country to country. And so you'll move from a non-regulated environment, if you will, to a regulated environment. And so you may want to manage that differently. So it may make sense to manufacture for Europe or Asia in that region beyond just the supply chain and operational benefits. It may be a requirement just because of the fact that you don't have the same scheduling throughout the world. So that's one of the things that is critical to look at.
So which market is closed? The one I'm in or the one I'm sending it to? I mean, so how's that? You know, it's a leading question, but
Well,
you know what I mean? Where's the problem?
It depends, and I mean, you might be able to help with this a bit,
No,
but reality, it depends. So, for instance, for the U.S., the expectation would be that you need to do there needs to be significant change to the actual product itself to bring that in. If the ability to make that product is existing here in the U.S., then the expectation is that it is managed in the U.S. So the concept of a closed environment, closed system. Whereas in the UK, as an example, depending on the active, you can move things in and out, and you can actually negotiate with the UK or with other regulatory bodies to move things in and out based on whether they have sufficient capability or capacity to make that product, as an example.
And you got to understand the import. You start with the import-export licenses is a good way to start, Russ, because you need to realize what you can bring in and what you can ship out. So with the U.S. being a closed market, you know, as David explained, you have to have a reason why you can't manufacture it here. They don't want all these products shipped in. It's a lot easier in ours. We do ship controlled substance amphetamine products to Canada from our plant, but we could never bring them in.
Correct.
And the worst nightmare I ever had when I was running the plant was we were working with a multinational customer and somebody didn't understand the import-export license. We didn't have an import license, and they sent me reference standard. And the guy signs for the FedEx box at the dock and brings it up and says, "This is personal hand delivered to Mike Plaza." And it's like, I looked at it and I knew what it was right away. I never opened it. I called the guy who hands the DEA, says, "You called DEA, what do I do with this?"
Right.
And we basically impounded it until the license came through, but he shipped it before our license got there. I couldn't receive it. We would have been fine.
Yeah.
And so you have to make sure both parties understand.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I was going to say from a CMO standpoint. We may not be the company that's distributing it outside, so we may not need to have that exporter license. It may be whatever partner we're manufacturing the drug for. They're the ones that would be responsible for that license, because typically after we manufacture the drug, we're going to send it off to them, and they may do some finished packaging or some additional work with that before it gets shipped out into the market. And so they would be responsible to handle that exporting license and understanding the rules around that.
So it sounds to me like, you know, if you're going to sell into Europe, that's EU, you know, you're getting a simple EU submission so that you can make, you know, it sounds like the DEA is about 7 steps behind where we are on the pharma regulatory side. In other words, that might be it, but each country may be specific to the type of compound.
But there's good reason for it. I mean, you just need to understand it. I mean, these are all products that are, if you're C2, it's C2 because of high level of potential diversion.
Right.
Right. So, you know, there's a reason there. You just have to understand it. If you're shipping to Europe from our site, we have to have the export license. We need to make sure who we're shipping it to has the proper import license. When those two marry up, then all the regulations are typically covered, because if they can't accept the product on their side and handle it and meet all the obligations, because once it's imported, it's now not ours anymore. Right now, as Lisa was
Right.
saying, you're relying on that other person to do it.
Yeah.
So if we have the export license, we know they have the import license, a transaction occurs, and it's like you're just passing the baton.
Yep. And it's to manage that control of the material. I mean, when you have the capability of, when you think of it from the DEA's perspective, when you have the capability of producing that product in a country or in a region, and that's where they have control, they want to be able to maintain that, not for the sake of control, but for the sake of you know, patients and you know, the public in general. I think it's an important approach, and I think I like that system better, to be quite frank, than the system of, well, I don't know if they've got capacity in this particular facility to produce that level of API, so you can bring it in if you want to. And I think those restrictions are important. They're also important restrictions. I mean, API usage is a perfect example, because I've seen that issue in the past, where you want to bring in an API from a certain country, and you may or may not be able to do that, especially if you've got global production or global markets that you sell to.
Yeah, most people, I think, at least I gotta say, I still see people go into this blind, and then, like, they decide they want to do offshore development, and they can't get off the starting block because they can't even get the API in that particular country. I mean, some countries are more draconian than others, I think. So, I mean, let's just pick it. I mean, of all the countries, if you were going to go offshore to do development, God forbid, right? I mean, but let's say we do that. I mean, what's got to be the most restrictive country? I mean, what areas?
Singapore, Saudi Arabia. I don't know.
Yeah, I would even
Those
say,
are
I would
two.
even say China, just because
China.
if you screw up, you can get death penalty.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a pretty significant penalty. Yeah.
We had in Singapore, we had one individual that they got off the plane and they arrested them. We had 2 tablets missing in a blister pack, and they were arrested. Not with Wellspring, but
Ouch.
right? So it's like,
Yeah.
so it can be significant. I think the other thing too is there's certain countries that just have that level of control. Middle East, I think, is certainly
absolutely,
one
yep.
where you need to do, if you can do anything, you need to do it from inside as opposed to outside.
What about APIs? I mean, you know, it sounds to me like that's also extremely limited. I mean, there's places in the world where you're not allowed to use certain APIs that are controlled. Is that right?
Yeah, but I think the API is a little bit different, because you do know, again, they need to get the license to be able to manufacture it. They're usually reputable companies. I think that's not an area you want your supply chain guy trying to save money. I'll just say it that way.
Right.
I don't know,
Yeah.
I'll let you guys weigh in, but for me, that's not an area where
No, I
we're looking
agree.
to.
Yeah, some are natural products or have natural starting points. So, I mean, you know, where you get your thebaine or whatnot for certain, let's say your morphine products, you know, that can make a difference as well, because some of these products you don't have a choice. You're not generally growing poppies in every country. So if you have to import from, you know, New Zealand, Australia, you're going to have to import something at some point to these countries, and then, you know, synthesize it from there. So there is the opportunity to do that, and there's certain molecules that certainly there is no option but to do that. And I think countries understand that, and regulatory bodies understand that. They just want to make sure there's a level of responsibility and oversight that is able to manage it.
So if it takes months to get a registration or a license in this country, it's got to be worse other places?
I get it. I think it's country by country.
Yeah.
You know, the more stringent their regulations are, the longer it's going to take to get the license. I don't know if that's your experience as well.
So let me see if I got this straight. So I make a Schedule 2 in, let's pick it, Georgia, and I'm going to distribute it worldwide. So that means every country I send it to, I have to have a license there? Is that the way this works? Or in other words, I got to send it to somebody.
And
So
they have to have the importers.
How do we
Right.
first,
So-
who's the somebody? If it, you know, all right, for a Novartis or a Pfizer, it may be one of our distribution centers. But let's face it, we haven't got them in every country. So who's the somebody?
You may have to find a partner within one of those countries that you're going to be able to work with, and you would send it to them, and they would be the importer of that material, and you're the exporter. Would be an example.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and That's exactly how I would answer that. It would be the individual that in that country is able to
Manage the
bring
inventory and distribute it.
Bring it in,
protect
exactly.
It. Yeah, and again, the more multinational you are, the more likely you're going to have depots throughout the world. Like you used Novartis as an example. I'm sure they have a group that handles that, and then they have to fill in the gaps. The real issue more is the smaller companies that are relying on partner companies.
Right.
And it's again, you have the export license and you want to ship there, but you still have to do due diligence that person can import the product. You don't want to have happen to them what I know happened to me once, where we didn't have the license in place yet, and the stuff showed up. I mean, you know, luckily the way we handled that was came from a multinational who happened to have a U.S. office, and we just had the FedEx bring the package over to them, and then when we were done, then they shipped it to us.
Yeah.
You know.
The other thing too is you know, at the end of the day, it also depends on whose name is on that tablet or capsule, because if you're distributing it, you know, as a CMO, you're going to find that you really are needing to partner with whoever it is that is distributing that product, because clearly you don't want a Novartis or a Pfizer or a a Purdue product in some country that then has the opportunity to be diverted. So your partners will not only demand that, but you yourself need to provide that, so that you're ensuring that it is appropriate in terms of how it's being managed. Because you can't be in a situation where, like you said, you can always ship something, right? It's really about how you're managing that whole process.
Well, and it's also what you put on the labels. Like you're not going to ship OxyContin and have red flashing lights on the thing telling everybody what's in the box, right?
Right.
So it's also how do you label it, what's on it. So again, it has to be discreet. So how else could FedEx deliver? The guy in the FedEx had no idea what was in the box.
Correct.
But we knew what
That's
was in the
common.
box.
So in the United States, let's just say, for example, if you're manufacturing in the South and your distribution centers, say, upstate New York. It's the examples I know, I'm sorry, but so what do you got to do? I mean, it sounds to me like when you start crossing state lines, I mean, is that all stuff you got to cover? Where's that at, Lisa? What do we got to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it still gets back to that license. I can export it to your New York facility, but they've got to have that importer license. And if they're going to turn back around and export it out, distribute it out worldwide, they've also got to have the exporting license to be able to do that as well.
I got you. So, and what sort of you had said, I mean, it sounds to me like you got to look at the transportation aspects. Got to be pretty specialized.
Absolutely. Dedicated trucks, seals, point to point. I mean, we knew how long it would take a truck. We did work with GSK back when they were doing, dexedrine, those older amphetamine products.
Yeah.
And, we put the material on the truck, and we knew it was going to take 9 hours to get to Philadelphia. We made sure that we loaded it. The truck was there the night before. We loaded it. That guy was on the road by 10 a.m., and he drove straight through.
Yeah.
And I think we've all heard the horror stories of, trucks have been
Diverted.
stolen and diverted, and then full trucks worth of controlled products are now out in the market where they're not supposed to be.
Correct. Yeah, you need a geofence at a minimum around
You need a
geofence. Basically, what was being described by Mike. Basically, you will know exactly where the material goes. I can tell you, for some companies, they actually will track each and every shipment throughout the U.S. And so they'll know when the truck is going. They'll know a stop, and they'll have communication. Have multiple drivers.
Yep.
You have seals. You have checkpoints. The other thing too is reduce your transportation. Don't expose something by driving it from one end of the country to the other end of the country and having a multiple stay over. Don't ship over a weekend. Don't.
Right.
I've had that in Northern Canada. There was a truck that we shipped a number of years ago that it was in a snowstorm, and so immediately you have to get everyone up there. Luckily, you have the benefit of the RCMP, so you can bring some people in. But it gets that serious that you need to be able to manage that in that way.
And it's coming a long way in the last even 10 years with, GPS trackers and everything. You know where
You
that
can see
shipment
everything.
is at all times.
Exactly.
20 years ago, we first got into controlled substances. It was just, what's the time? Where's the guy? They used 2 drivers. We knew a trucking company, where they switched. And the one guy took it from, Kentucky to whatever, and the next guy took it from whatever to Philadelphia or whatever they were taking it.
Right.
Yeah.
North Carolina, wherever distribution those guys were doing it in. And then it was in their network and it was there. But now it's so much more complex. You're putting in trackers. It's in 2 different places in the truck. One that if someone was to hijack it, they could see it, and one that's not.
And
Yep.
the seals and
You know,
everything have evolved
yeah.
over that time frame as well.
Right.
So the controls are
Somebody-
absolutely much better today than they used to be.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody, just so you know. Probably some of the major delays I've had in major projects has always been ignorance of this particular process, you know, and so much for that blockbuster, you know what I mean? So what are you going to do? Thank you very much.
Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX 2016, presents INTERPHEX Live.